And here we are again. By golly, the weeks fly by. A very warm welcome. This is another episode of the Coaching Hour podcast, although I'm not sure why we keep calling it a podcast because it has evolved from where it was a little while ago. Lovely to have you with us. My name is Paul Rotherham, and welcome to this edition. We are minus one of the roses today, I'm afraid. You still have the thorn in the form of me, and we have one of our roses in the form of Mareka. No Mary today, but Mareka is with me as always. Hello, Mareka.
Hi, Paul.
Nice to have you with us. Thank you so much, Mareka. If you didn't know, heads up Coaches Network South Africa. And this podcast or program or show is brought to you in partnership with Coaches Network South Africa. If you're watching this in a space or on a platform where you haven't yet seen what Coaches Network South Africa is all about, then we encourage you to check it out. So you'll find it on Facebook, among other channels. And it's not only an educational and information platform, but it does a great job of connecting like-minded people and fellow coaches, not only from South Africa, but around the world. So if you are in the coaching space, check it out and remember that name, Coaches Network South Africa. Another name that I think you will have remembered by the end of this podcast is going to be introduced to you now by Mareka, because we have a lovely guest once again.
We do. Thank you so much, Paul. Today we have Steph Dawson-Cosser. She actually has over 40 years experience in helping people to manage change, not only in their personal life, but also in the workspace. So Steph has a lot of experience, in coaching, and she now recently you work a lot with relationships as well. And that is our topic also for today, how to deal with conflict in relationships. And I'm sure that Paul also will be very interested in this topic. We all have certain level of conflict, I'm sure, in our relationships at some point or every now and again, even though we don't like it. It's inevitable, I guess. But before we get into the topic, Steph, please just tell our listeners and everyone that's watching, who is Steph? How did you get into the space of coaching?
Thanks so much, Mareka and Paul. My first career path was in childcare. I'm originally from the UK and I trained as a nursery nurse. Nothing exists like that in South Africa. But it introduced me to, number one, family life and care of the child 0 to 7 years. And over the years, my experience in hands-on childcare evolved into a variety of situations. Since arriving in South Africa, I started a consultancy where we were designing childcare solutions for private families and for the corporate space. And when I was at LeaderX Expo, I found a room full of energized people. And I was wondering, what on earth is going on in there? And I went in and found a room full of coaches. And I said, well, what's coaching? And I spent the rest of the day there being introduced to a number of coaches who use a number of different modalities. And I realized that that was exactly the career shift I was wanting to make. That was back in 2009.
Sure.
And I embarked on my shift in career from then. And I realized that as much as I moved into the leadership space by joining another coaching organization, my passion for supporting family life had never left me. And that was really what had driven my hands-on childcare experience, then the consultancy and designing childcare solutions. And I really wanted to find my way back to supporting family life. And so my coaching pathway moved over predominantly into private coaching with individuals, couples, and family groups.
Okay.
So that's the pathway.
Great. Thank you so much, Steph, for giving us that background. And why specifically did you choose this topic today, how to resolve conflict in relationships? I really feel it's an important topic. And why are you specifically passionate about this specific area?
So if I were to sit and analyze the clients that come through my door, either on the screen or physically into the room, most of the individuals and couples have had some kind of disconnect with somebody they really care about. And when couples come, there's often one who's driving that process and the other feels like they're being dragged through the door. Sometimes they both want to come through the door with equal interest and energy. But the point is that in life, we know connection from the start of baby being born, put onto mum's chest, or in being held by dad. That is the instant experience of connection. If they've had it, if the infant goes into ICU for whatever reason or any other complications, they've already now experienced a disconnect. And that's something that is hardwired in us. We're seeking for connection, to feel safe, to feel we don't have the words for seen, heard, and understood, but our needs met. And that gives us a sense of calm and ease before we even know what words are. And but that's something that is hardwired in us. So when we adult and we find somebody that we call it falling in love, and we've got that sense of oneness, that sense of I'm being seen, I'm being heard, I want more of this good feeling. We often end up going down the aisle, formalizing our connection in some kind of way. It may not be a marriage per se, but it's a formalizing our long-term commitment to each other in some sort of way. But invariably, life is going to happen. We have to make decisions. Do we want a pet? Do we not want a pet? Do we want children? Do we not want children? That's before who's going to get the shopping and put out the bin. All of these everyday things that we think we will navigate. And then one day, I'm not going to put out the bin. And that irritates my partner. We experience disconnect. And even over these so-called trivial everyday things, suddenly we're experiencing a disconnect. And so people who have not learned how to build reconnection, so we're wired for connection, but in life we're going to experience disconnection over trivial and big things. And what we haven't learned is how to navigate our way to reconnection. And so it's that final part of, okay, it's okay to not agree, but it's what we do with that disagreement that matters. And that's often what people haven't learned in their home of origin or family of origin, or they've learned certain patterns that they think, I would never want that. Parents who stonewall and who the children feel like they're walking on eggshells because they don't know what's going down with the parents. Or it's very aggressive and explosive. And that's terrifying for a child. So they hide away. They're not learning how to build the reconnection. And so when we adult, the pattern that we learned for coping in that family space, to hide away or to engage and get more volatile, that's not going to work with our partner now. And that's where things fall apart. And so it's about a communication. It's about understanding values. It's about how to understand that it's okay to not agree on everything. In fact, that's part of what makes the buzz between them, that they've got different ideas. But how do we keep the communication open when we do not agree, so that we can find a compromise, so that we can find a solution? And so essentially, I mean, if I really simplified everything, what I do is I teach adults how to communicate.
It's so interesting, isn't it, Steph? Because we live in an age, I think, the mere fact that here we are, three of us from different corners of the country, all connected on one screen, you would think that we're living in an age where connection is easy and that connection should be happening now faster and easier and more than ever before. But in fact, it's the opposite. We all live in silos, and forever we're reading these comments of, I have a teenage daughter, she's 18, and we've experienced it ourselves, where you are literally living in a world where physically you are probably way more disconnected than when we were growing up without technology, because a lot of time is spent connected to a phone, messaging, checking social media feeds, And you would think that with all this technology, brilliant, we're able to connect. But I'm finding just the opposite has happened. So technology isn't always our friend in this, but it can be a friend if it's used in the right way, I assume.
Absolutely. And I think you've hit on a real key there, because we are so busy connecting through screens and technology that we're forgetting about the people who are sitting across the lounge from us or in the next door room. And we're forgetting how to actually have a regular conversation, because WhatsApp and, texting is so open to interpretation. And whether I'm dealing with a teenager who's distressed that their friend has said something awful, or dissed them, in the group, or ignored their comment in a group, that is terrifying for a teenager. And yet they're sitting in the same room, in the classroom, and no conversation is happening. So
And the same's happening with adults. I don't know when last you went out for a meal, Steph, and perhaps with your significant other, if there is one, or Mareka, and you go out to a restaurant and you have a look around the room and you see that there are couples and there are families, but they're not connected. I would say more often than not, and I'm not a statistician, but my observation has shown that more often than not, people are sitting physically in the same space, but nobody's talking to anyone. They're on their phones. Not all the time, but often, more often than not.
Absolutely. I can concur. We went out for supper a week ago with our son and his partner, and we had our phones off the table in handbags and whatever, all around us, tables full of people. And some of them were taking photos of the event, which is fair enough. But the point is, it never goes away after that. Then they're flipping through all the photos that the waitress took and so on. And so they're distracted. And so the scary part of that is when we are parenting our children, young parents with young children, the children are grabbing the phone to say me, 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 when they're, they only have a few words. And children are learning to swipe rather than turn a page in a book. They're crying for the phone to get parents' attention, but they're also wanting to play on this thing. Fair enough, because it's always in the parent's hand. But the trouble is that when children want the flat screen thing, they're going to have all sorts of complications because they're not learning how to cross the midline, and which are the basics for reading, which is passing something, turning something, and so on. So this screen life that we live, this digital life that we live, has all sorts of complications as well as gifts. And it's about finding the balance between the two.
And I think Mareka will agree, we don't want to focus on technology in this podcast or conversation, because inevitably it comes up in all areas of life, and it is definitely a factor. And I think that's something to be mindful of, is that tech, for all that it's wonderful, does have a dark side. But obviously today, that's not the focus of the conversation. I think what we like to do is we always like to try and give our audience some real life tips and advice in terms of how we can take this theory and understand what the problems are and what leads to conflict and breaking down communication and no connectivity and all of those things, and what we can do practically in life to try and get a step closer to being people who are better connected and less in conflict.
Sure. So often when I have connected with a couple, I begin to make sense of what's brought them into coaching. Many things do bring them into into coaching, but it's frequently that one or other, or sometimes both, are not feeling seen or heard or understood by the other. And so first of all, it's about finding the patterns of their behavior. So when do they connect? What's brought the disconnection? How long has that been going on? And sometimes it's very, very early in a relationship, and sometimes they come 15, 20, 30 years down the line. And so there are pockets of time in relationships that often, pardon me, are triggers for disconnection. So the one is they've longed for a baby, baby comes. What they hadn't planned for was how much time and attention and energy caring for an infant is. And so one partner or the other feels like they're carrying more weight than more of the commitment to caring for the baby, and the other feels left out, shut out, perhaps. So that's one of the times. When children go to school, big decisions have to be made. That's another time. And is mum going back to a career, or is dad the homemaker? So making these decisions are key times. And then the one much later on is when children have flown the nest. That's a big one when couples come in to coaching, because they've spent their whole life focused on earning enough, making a home, raising the kids, getting them through matric and into whatever they're going to do after school. Now what? And suddenly couples where they've been focused very much on the children, they're now left seeing each other. And they haven't really connected for a very long time. So often when I am starting with a couple, the process, we go right back to values. What are the values that you align your life to? Because those are the drivers of how we show up, how we behave, how we respond to different situations that arise. And often they've got one or two aligned, but there are often divergent values. And that's not an end in itself to say, oh, well, we'll never get together again, because there was something that got them together. And so often it's about reflecting back to what did bring them together, what did connect them, what they valued, what they loved, what they were attracted to see if there's still some energy there. Because as long as we can remember that first spark, we have hope for finding a way to reignite. Yes, we might be 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, even 30 years down the line. But there was a spark, and if we can remember that, then we've got something to work with. So we start with re-looking, refreshing. What are the values that we count as critical for ourselves, and discuss those, and discuss the differences. The differences are actually what creates a healthy relationship, when we can pool those values together. So that would be step one. And just that conversation where they've learned to listen to what the other is saying about the values they hold, and the conversation the dialogue that builds from that. That's already building a solid foundation, because they're actually having a conversation and facing each other in that moment.
I often wonder, Steph, how many people even get to that step one, as you've referred to it. And I won't mention any names. You may both be aware of who I'm referring to, but I saw a post on social media yesterday that's got the country buzzing in terms of a very high-profile relationship and marriage that is now coming to an end. And I was discussing it actually with Zena, my wife, last night, and we were just saying it's so sad because there are children involved. Aside from that, the fact that this couple have traveled the road that they have and have now found that, okay, for whatever reason, they're not going to go any further. And I say this respectfully. I think we're in an age where there are a whole lot of things that create false expectation. Where years ago, you would stick out a marriage, you would stay with a partner through the ups and downs. I mean, it's even in your wedding vows, your marriage vows, that through good times and bad, in sickness and health. Where now, my observation is, the moment there's the slightest speed bump in the road and things don't go our way, we throw in the towel. And it's very sad. And it just reminded me of the post that I saw last night. And to be honest, whether it's a high profile couple and celebrities, or whether it's Joe Blogs and Mrs. Blogs around the corner, it shouldn't matter, because any failed marriage or dissolution of marriage is sad in many ways. But yeah, we live in an age where I think it's instant gratification, and if you don't get what you want now, well, then I'm out of here.
Yeah.
And that I think crosses all areas: relationships, business, friendships, and a whole lot of other parts of our life where we just have these expectations that are totally unrealistic.
And I think that's the key thing, is that we grow up in a family of origin that shapes what we are looking for. Either we want the same as, or something completely opposite of what we've experienced. And that depends on how family life was. But media, films, society at large is that we must have our needs met. Now, when a child has been indulged to get anything and everything they ask for, they've never heard the word no because a parent is scared to upset the child. We end up with a child who becomes an adult who expects and demands everything that they want, when they want, how they want. And we would call that a grandiose approach to life. It can also lead to a very narcissistic kind of way of being in the world. Now, depending on who they attract to themselves as a partner, they want to please this person because they've got so much to share, and so the grandiose person might pull up in a very smart car, have a very smart home, have a great income, which they've also worked hard to, worked at, creating. But then something doesn't go awry, or if we have a grandiose boyfriend and a girlfriend that's bedazzled by this guy who seems to have everything, but then he asks for something of her that she's not prepared to give. And then she sees a very different side of his personality. Now, often that will only happen after the grand marriage and the big, display in media and so on. And maybe perhaps often that happens when a child comes along, because now mum has to attend to baby first. Husband is no longer number one. And this power play because I'm taking the patriarchal line here, the husband has always got it his way. And now his wife is saying, I've got to attend to the baby. I'm tired. I don't want sex tonight. I can't do sex tonight. And so he's suddenly discovering no for the first time in his life. And that's when things begin to fall apart. Affairs happen, etc. So at whatever point somebody comes, often in a situation like that, the wife, if we keep with that scenario, the wife will make the appointment. This is still in the early stages of the marriage, maybe in the first 8-10 years of the marriage, if it's lasted that long. And she will drag the husband in, only if he's willing for change. And it's going to be a change on both their parts. But we've got to understand the why we behave and have expectations the way we do have, and recognize the impact that those expectations and demands have on the other. And that's where the blind spots are, or have been. And so my role as the coach is to enable them to see the other, to recognize their part, their contribution. I often give them this question. And it's a tough one, because I actually ask them to go home and think about it and journal about it and come back to the next session with, what is my contribution to the very thing I'm complaining about? Because every time we nag or name, shame, and blame somebody, we're pointing a metaphorical finger. We may be actually pointing a finger, but there's 3 fingers pointing back at us. So what is my contribution? And invariably, that's the wake-up call, because it's very easy to point the finger at the other person.
It's
But
true.
the introspection is where we get leverage to start working on the relationship.
Yes. Yeah, I think, this topic is so broad, actually. One can actually, have different topics within relationship challenges that we have. I mean, we can talk, I guess, for the whole day on the different challenges. As a final question, I think, disconnection is also sometimes a choice, where you internally, where someone you've maybe brought the same type of issue up many times and it just doesn't change or doesn't seem like they care, whatever, then there is a point where you decide, you know what, I've had it, I'm tired of this, I'm going to stop trying. So internally, maybe consciously, maybe subconsciously, you decide to kind of step back or to disconnect a bit. So if one is aware of that moment, how can the person shift maybe their perspective to not disconnect when those things inevitably happens?
So that's a really important question, Mareka, and I'm so glad you've highlighted that, because that's also part of the waking up. So my contribution to this disconnected relationship is that I'm disconnecting to it. And so the growth process that I would work with that person is on where do you begin? So how do you become aware of when you begin to disconnect? And invariably that is sitting in the body. That sensation of my stomach's cramping. Oh boy, here he goes again. Or my heart starts racing because I'm really anxious about he's come home, my partner's come home, and he's had too much alcohol. What's going to happen? So my heart is racing. I'm actually fearful of what's going to happen, and I'm going to disconnect and protect myself. So the first thing is to wake up to the somatic experience and then ask oneself, so what is the most important thing I can do now to stay engaged? If it's a case of needing to self-protect, then that's the question you have to ask. How do I keep myself safe? But if it's about engaging, re-engaging, then it's what is the best thing I can do in order to stay engaged? And we grow that muscle in the coaching process. And also for the recipient of that. So we're waking up what is happening in our system. The nervous system is talking to us all the time. And so, but we often don't understand we haven't connected into it. So we often live our life here. And a lot of what happens in coaching is connecting to the rest of what's going on inside us.
Very important. Thank you, Steph. Yeah, I think it's just the first step, I guess, to become aware. I love that question. What can I do to stay connected? Because it's so easy to maybe in that moment, because you feel a bit anxious or nervous or upset, to lash out, or whatever the case might be, instead of how can I stay engaged, I guess, in a healthy manner.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time, Steph. It's always wonderful having these guests or guests such as yourself join us. My last question, if I may, are there any resources that you could recommend for people to check out if they are finding themselves in positions where there's conflict and communication breakdown? Any good books out there, or perhaps you've even got content available somewhere?
So on my website, I have some content available. And I think if I look at just the 3 books I have on my table here, Esther Perel does a podcast. She's got a podcast channel. She's got great resources. The State of Affairs is an incredible resource for a couple where somebody has had an affair. And she shows us very clearly that an affair is not the end of the road. It doesn't have to be the end of the road. And this is a great book to read. And then I think the other one that I'm afraid it's pretty stained because it's well used is Terry Reel's Us. And I am presently on his training now for relational life therapy. And he very clearly does not count such things as an affair being the end of the road. Even somebody who's a narcissist is not a endless, hopeless case if they want to do the work together. The key is both parties. It takes two to make the relationship work, and one to count it as ended. I'll leave you with that thought.
Wonderful. Steph, thank you. We appreciate having you as our guest today. And to you watching or listening, thank you so much for being here. The links and any other important information will be in the description. Thank you for your time, Mareka. As always, remember to check out the Coaches Network SA Facebook page. Anything else from you, Mareka, before we love and leave you for this one?
No, thank you, Paul. I think just if you want to stay in touch with any upcoming guests and information, subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. And we are on Spotify. And then you can be up to date with any new guests and interesting topics that we discuss.
Magic. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, everyone. And we look forward to your company on the next one.